The city was a living, breathing beast of noise and light, but inside the high stone walls of the DeLanza mansion, a deep, heavy silence reigned. This was a place of shadows and secrets, a world within a world, governed by one unbreakable rule: do not be seen, do not be heard. For Eva Moreno, this was the simple, stark reality of her life. She was a ghost in the grand hallways, a silent figure polishing the dark wood and dusting the expensive vases that cost more than her entire life before. She moved through the rooms with a quiet efficiency, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cold marble floors. Her father, a kind man with a head for dreams but not for business, had left her with a mountain of debt when he passed. The job at the DeLanza estate was the only one that paid enough to chip away at that mountain. It was a contract, a cage with gilded bars. She understood the terms. Keep your head down. Do your work. Speak only when spoken to. And above all, never, ever draw the attention of the man who owned it all. Dante DeLanza. His name was rarely spoken above a whisper, even by the most trusted of his staff. He was more a force of nature than a man, a storm that occasionally swept through the house, leaving a charged, nervous energy in its wake. Eva had only seen him in glimpses, a dark coat disappearing around a corner, the low rumble of his voice from behind a closed office door. That was enough. She felt the weight of his presence even when he wasn't there, a constant, unspoken pressure in the air. Her day was a careful routine of chores, each one timed to perfection to avoid any chance encounters. She cleaned his study only when he was confirmed to be miles away in the city. She changed the linens in his massive bedroom early in the morning, when the first rays of sun were just hitting the windows, and he was certainly still asleep. Her world was one of small, manageable tasks, of finding tiny moments of peace in the ordered chaos of servitude. In the evenings, when her official duties were done, she would sometimes sit in the small, sparse room that was hers at the very back of the house, and she would read. Books were her escape, her only true possession, a way to visit worlds where there were no debts and no fearsome, mysterious men. One such evening, she realized she was out of her favorite tea. It was a small thing, a tiny luxury, but it felt important. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Albright, had already retired for the night. Gathering her courage, Eva decided to slip out to the corner store a few blocks away. She pulled on a simple, dark coat, hoping it would make her invisible on the city streets, just as her maid's uniform made her invisible in the mansion. The night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the always perfect temperature of the house. She walked quickly, her head down, her arms wrapped around herself. The store was brightly lit and mostly empty. She found her tea quickly, paid with a few crumpled bills from her small wages, and stepped back out into the night, feeling a small sense of victory. The feeling was short-lived. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the deeper shadows of an alleyway, blocking her path. She knew him. Everyone who worked for Dante knew the faces of his enemies. This was Marco, a low-level enforcer for the Rossi family, their main rivals. He smelled of cheap cigars and something sharper, more dangerous. Well, he sneered, his voice a gravelly scrape. Look what the cat dragged out. The little mouse from the DeLanza house. Eva tried to step around him, her heart hammering against her ribs. I have nothing for you, she whispered, her voice trembling. He moved with her, cutting off her escape. Oh, I think you do. A pretty little thing like you, dusting his desk, making his bed, you must hear things. You must see things. What's the boss planning, little mouse? Who's he meeting? I don't know anything, Eva said, more firmly this time, clutching her small bag of tea like a shield. I'm just the maid. Marco's friendly sneer vanished. His hand shot out, his fingers digging into her upper arm, yanking her closer. Don't play dumb with me. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she held her ground, shaking her head. His eyes, dark and angry, scanned her face. Then, with a speed that stole her breath, his other hand came up and he slapped her, hard, across the cheek. The sound was a sharp crack in the quiet night. Pain, hot and stinging, bloomed on her skin. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Think about it, Marco hissed, his face inches from hers. Next time I ask, you'll have an answer. He released her with a shove, and she stumbled back, catching herself against the cold brick wall. He disappeared back into the shadows, leaving her alone, her cheek throbbing and her whole body shaking. She ran all the way back to the mansion, her breath catching in sobs she dared not release. She slipped inside through the servants' entrance, her heart pounding. In the small mirror in her room, she saw the mark. A red, angry handprint was already darkening into a bruise on her pale skin. Panic set in. How could she hide this? How could she explain it? She was supposed to be invisible, and a bruise like this was a glaring, obvious sign. She tried to cover it with powder, but it was no use. The swelling and discoloration were too pronounced. She decided her only hope was to finish her evening chores quickly and retreat to her room before anyone saw her. Her final task was to ensure the main foyer was clear and the front door was locked for the night. It was as she was checking the heavy deadbolt that she heard the roar of a car engine, the crunch of tires on gravel, and the slam of a car door. Her blood ran cold. He was home. And he was early. She froze, hoping she could melt into the shadows before he entered. The massive oak door swung open, and Dante DeLanza filled the doorway. He was bigger, more imposing up close than he had ever been in her fleeting glimpses. He wore a long, dark coat, and his tie was loosened. He radiated a fury that was almost a physical force. He slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the silent hall. He was muttering under his breath, his jaw clenched, his knuckles raw and slightly bloody. He had clearly come from a meeting that had not gone his way. He didn't see her at first, lost in his own storm. He shrugged off his coat and threw it over a nearby chair. It was then that his dark, furious eyes swept the room and landed on her. She was standing perfectly still, hoping to be mistaken for a piece of furniture. But his gaze locked onto her. He saw the way she held herself, rigid and terrified. His eyes, sharp and missing nothing, narrowed. He took a step toward her, then another. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. Ava dropped her gaze to the floor, the rules screaming in her head. Don't look at him. But he didn't let her. He moved closer until the tips of his polished shoes entered her downcast vision. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, something dark and spicy, mixed with the cold night air. A large, warm hand came up and gently, but with undeniable firmness, cupped her chin. His touch was electric, sending a jolt through her entire nervous system. He tilted her face up, forcing her to look at him. His eyes, a stormy gray, scanned her face, and she saw the exact moment they found the bruise. The fury in them, which had been a diffuse, general anger, suddenly sharpened, focused, and zeroed in on that one, single mark on her skin. The air in the room seemed to vanish. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, quiet, and more terrifying than any shout. Who touched you? The silence that followed Dante's question was heavier than any Ava had ever known. It was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it impossible to breathe, to think, to do anything but stare into the stormy gray eyes locked on hers. His thumb, which still rested gently against her jawline, brushed the edge of the bruise, a touch so at odds with the violence simmering in his gaze. She could feel the warmth of his hand, the slight roughness of his skin, and it sent a confusing shiver through her, a mix of terror and something else, something she dared not name. It was nothing, she stammered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast, silent foyer. The instinct to lie, to retreat, to avoid causing more trouble was a deeply ingrained habit. I fell. In the kitchen. I was clumsy. It was a weak story, and she knew it the moment the words left her lips. Dante's expression did not change. He didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stared, his gaze stripping away her feeble lie layer by layer until she felt utterly exposed. Ava, he said, and the sound of her name on his lips, spoken for the first time, was a shock. He knew her name. He knew which ghost drifted through his halls. Do not lie to me. I know the mark of a man's hand. Who touched you? The command in his voice was absolute. It brooked no argument, no hesitation. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed, a man for whom the truth was not a request but a demand. And in that moment, something inside Ava broke. The fear, the loneliness, the weight of the debt and the servitude and the constant, gnawing worry, all coalesced into a single, desperate need to tell someone. To tell him. The name tumbled out in a broken whisper. Marco. From the Rossi family. He stopped me on my way back from the store. Dante's eyes closed for a fraction of a second, a slow, deliberate blink, as if he was imprinting the name onto the back of his eyelids. When they opened again, the storm had been replaced by a terrifying, glacial calm. He released her chin, his hand dropping to his side. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his study, pulling a phone from his pocket. He didn't shut the door. He wanted her to hear, she realized. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. His voice was low and flat, devoid of all the fury she had witnessed moments before, which made it all the more frightening. It's Dante. Marco. Rossi crew. Find him. I want him brought to the old warehouse. I want to have a conversation with him about the consequences of touching what is mine. There was a pause as he listened to the person on the other end. "I don't care how you do it. Just get it done. Now." He ended the call. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was charged, electric with the promise of retribution. Ava stood frozen in the foyer, her mind reeling. "What is mine?" The words echoed in her head, their meaning shifting and expanding, too immense to fully grasp. Did he mean his property? His staff? Or something else entirely? Dante emerged from the study, his gaze finding her once more. "You will not leave this house unaccompanied again," he stated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. It was not a suggestion, it was a new law, decreed by the king of this small, dark kingdom. "And from now on, you will bring my morning coffee to my study. Yourself." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the grand foyer, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. The world had tilted on its axis in the space of 5 minutes. She was no longer invisible. The next morning, the city knew. It started as a low rumble, a piece of shocking gossip passed in hushed, excited tones in coffee shops and on street corners. Dante DeLanza's men had found Marco in a seedy bar on the outskirts of town. They had dragged him out, and he had been delivered to a nondescript warehouse. What happened inside was the stuff of dark legend, but the result was clear. Marco was never going to use his right hand again, and a message had been sent, crystal clear and written in pain, to every corner of the city. "Do not touch the maid from the DeLanza mansion." By noon, the story had mutated, grown new, more intriguing layers. It wasn't just about a maid anymore. Whispers followed Ava the few times she ventured into the main parts of the house. The other staff members looked at her differently, not with disdain, but with a new, cautious respect, and a healthy dose of fear. Her life took on a new, surreal routine. Every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, her heart would hammer a frantic rhythm as she prepared Dante's coffee, black, 2 sugars, and carried the heavy porcelain cup on a small tray to his study. The first few times, she would knock softly, place the cup on his desk, and flee as quickly as she could without actually running. But he began to stop her. "Ava." He would say her name, and she would freeze at the door. "The weather report for today." Or, "Remind Mrs. Albright I have guests for dinner." Small, simple commands, but they forced her to stay, to stand in his presence for a few moments longer. Then, the commands turned into questions. "What do you think of this painting?" he asked one morning, gesturing to a dark, abstract canvas on the wall. She was so startled she almost dropped the tray. I don't know, sir." "It looks sad," she ventured, her voice barely audible. He had looked from the painting to her, a long, considering look, and gave a slow, single nod. "It is," he had said, and said nothing more, dismissing her. Days turned into weeks. The morning coffee meetings became the anchor of her day, and she suspected, of his. He began to talk to her. Not at her, but to her. He asked about the books she was reading. He commented on the state of the garden she sometimes walked in. He never smiled, not really, but the harsh lines of his face would sometimes soften when he listened to her talk. She, in turn, began to see the man behind the myth. She saw the tiredness in his eyes after a long night, the weight of the decisions he had to make, the profound loneliness that clung to him like a second shadow. The monster the city feared was, in the quiet of the morning, just a man, a complicated, dangerous, but deeply solitary man. One afternoon, a large, flat box tied with a silk ribbon was delivered to her room. There was no card. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a dress. It was a deep emerald green, simple in cut but made of a fabric so luxurious it felt like water in her hands. She had never owned, or even touched, anything so beautiful. That evening, Mrs. Albright came to her room with a message. "Mr. DeLanza requests your presence in the main drawing room at 8 o'clock. He is hosting a gathering." The housekeeper's eyes flicked to the dress laid out on Ava's bed, and her lips pursed in a tight, unreadable line. Panic seized Ava. A gathering? With his guests? The powerful, dangerous people who moved in his world? This was not the world of a maid. This was something else entirely. But the command had been given. At 8 o'clock, wearing the emerald dress that fit her as if it had been made for her, she descended the grand staircase. Her legs felt like jelly. The drawing room was filled with well-dressed men and women, the air thick with perfume and the clink of glasses. The conversation died the moment she appeared in the doorway. Every eye turned to her. She saw curiosity, shock, and in the eyes of the women, a sharp, calculating assessment. Then Dante was there. He cut through the crowd, his presence commanding the space. He was wearing a tailored black suit, and his eyes, when they found her, held a heat that made her breath catch. He didn't smile. He simply offered her his arm. "Ava," he said, his voice carrying easily in the silent room. He did not introduce her as the maid. He did not introduce her at all. He simply led her to his side, his hand covering hers where it rested on his arm, a possessive, unmistakable gesture. He was showing the entire city, packed into his drawing room, what he had declared to Marco in that warehouse. She was under his protection. She was his. The party was a blur of nervous smiles and vague conversations Ava barely registered. She stayed close to Dante, a fixed point in a swirling sea of unknown dangers. It was later, when she needed a moment of air, that she found herself on a secluded balcony overlooking the garden. She was leaning against the railing, trying to calm her racing heart, when she heard the voices. Two men were standing just below, in the shadow of a large tree, their conversation drifting up to her on the cool night air. "A brilliant move, really," one man said, his voice familiar. It was Salvatore, one of Dante's most trusted captains. Using the maid as the trigger. Marco played his part perfectly. Ava's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. DeLanza took the bait exactly as we hoped, the other man, whose voice she didn't recognize, replied. "He thinks the Russes are getting bold, that they started a war by touching his property. He's ready to move against them. He has no idea the threat is right here, under his own roof. Once he's distracted with the war we created," Salvatore said, a cruel smile in his voice, "taking his place will be simple." The boss got soft. Sentimental. Worrying about a maid. It made him weak. It made him vulnerable. The truth crashed down on Ava with the force of a physical blow. The attack on her wasn't random. It wasn't about her at all. It was a trap for Dante. A plot from within his own organization to use his protectiveness over her to start a fake war, to weaken him, and to overthrow him. Marco was a pawn. She was the bait. And Dante, the man who had avenged her, who had brought her into his light, was walking blindly into a coup. The fear she felt now was colder and sharper than any she had felt before. It wasn't fear for herself. It was a terrifying, clarifying fear for him. She had to warn him. Everything had changed. The voices from the garden below faded, swallowed by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the party, but their poisonous words echoed endlessly in Ava's mind. A trap. A plot. Under his own roof. The beautiful emerald dress suddenly felt like a costume, the glittering party a stage for a coming tragedy. Her fear for herself, a constant companion for so long, vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp terror that was entirely for Dante. The man who had looked at a bruise on a maid's face and saw a reason to shake the foundations of the city was now blind to the knife aimed at his back, a knife wielded by a hand he trusted. She moved on instinct, slipping back into the crowded drawing room. Her eyes scanned the faces, finding him instantly. Dante stood near the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, surrounded by men who nodded at his words. Salvatore was among them, his face a mask of loyal concern. The sight made Ava's stomach turn. How long had he been planning this? How many of the other smiling, nodding men were part of the betrayal? She felt the weight of the secret, a crushing burden that she alone carried. To speak it here, in front of everyone, would be a death sentence for her. It would start the very war Salvatore wanted, right in this room, and she and Dante would be at the center of it. She had to get him alone. She waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, forcing her expression into what she hoped was a calm mask. When a server passed by with a tray, Dante turned slightly to place his empty glass on it. It was the moment she needed. She caught his eye. For a second, his gaze was distant, still occupied with the business of being the boss. Then he focused on her, and she tried to pour every ounce of the urgency she felt into her own eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, her eyes pleading. "Please. Now." A flicker of confusion, then understanding, crossed his face. He was a man who read subtle threats for a living. Her silent, desperate signal was a language he understood perfectly. He murmured something to the men around him, who chuckled as if he'd made a joke, and then he was cutting through the crowd toward her. He didn't stop, simply took her elbow in a firm grip and guided her from the room, his presence a shield that parted the guests. To anyone watching, it looked like a possessive lover leading his partner away for a private moment. No one, not even Salvatore, could have guessed the truth. He led her not to his study, but to a small, soundproofed library at the back of the house, a room she had never entered. The moment the door clicked shut, the noise of the party vanished, replaced by a thick, tense silence. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes searching her face. The fear, held in check for so long, finally broke free. The words tumbled out of her in a rushed, panicked whisper. "The balcony. I heard Salvatore, and another man. Marco, he was working for them. For Salvatore. They wanted you to think it was the Russes. They wanted you to start a war. They said you got soft because of me. They said it made you weak. They're going to try to take your place." She watched as the truth settled over him. It was not a sudden, explosive anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was a slow, chilling transformation. The man who had been slowly revealing himself to her over weeks of quiet mornings receded, and the Mafia Boss, the strategist, the predator, took his place. His eyes grew flat and cold, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. He believed her. He didn't question her, didn't ask for proof. He simply absorbed the information and began to calculate. "Salvatore," he said, the name a curse. He walked to the desk, picked up a phone, and dialed a number. "Luca. It's Dante. The party is over. I want every exit sealed. No one leaves. Do it quietly. Then, bring Salvatore to my study. Tell him it's urgent. And Luca, disarm him." He hung up and turned back to Ava. The coldness in his eyes softened, just for her. "You need to go to your room. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." "No," she said, the word surprising even her. She stood her ground, the emerald dress feeling less like a costume and more like armor now. "They'll know I told you. If I disappear, they'll know. Let me stay. Let me be part of this." She was tired of being protected, of being a pawn in someone else's game. She had uncovered the plot. She would not be sent away like a child while he faced the consequences. He looked at her, a long, measuring look, and she saw a new respect dawning in his gaze. He saw not the scared maid, but the woman who had stood in the path of a storm to warn him. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Then you stay with me. You say nothing. You watch." He led her back to his study, positioning her in a high-backed leather chair in the corner, a place of shadow and observation. Minutes later, there was a knock. Salvatore entered, a confident smile on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You wanted to see me, boss?" The confrontation was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, brutal dissection. Dante didn't accuse him outright. He spoke in circles, about loyalty, about history, about the cost of betrayal. He watched Salvatore's reactions, the slight twitch of his eye, the way his hands clenched. He mentioned Marco's name, and saw the flicker of panic. He spoke of the Russes, and saw the relief that it was still, supposedly, about them. And then, with the precision of a surgeon, Dante laid out the entire plot, piece by piece, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. He revealed that he knew everything. The confidence drained from Salvatore's face, replaced by a sheen of sweat and raw fear. He broke, his words spilling out in a desperate attempt to save himself, naming the other conspirators. When Salvatore was led away by Luca, a broken man, the house was already being purged. The other traitors were rounded up with quiet, brutal efficiency. The party guests were informed of a minor security issue and sent home. The war with the Russes was called off before a single shot was fired. In the space of an hour, Dante had not only survived a coup, he had crushed it completely, strengthening his position more than ever. And it was all because of the woman sitting silently in the corner. When they were alone again in the study, the silence felt different. The danger had passed. The air was clear. Dante walked over to her and knelt before her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers. It was a gesture of humility from a man who bowed to no one. "You saved me tonight," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "Not just my power. My life." "They were wrong, you know," Ava whispered, her hand reaching out, almost of its own volition, to touch his face. "You protecting me, it wasn't a weakness. It was the only thing that saved you." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "It was the only thing that made me want to be saved," he confessed, his guard down completely. "Before you, this was just a kingdom of shadows. You brought the light into it, Ava. You." He stood, pulling her to her feet with him. "The debt is gone. Consider it paid 100 times over. You are free. You can leave tonight, if you want. I will give you enough money to live anywhere, to do anything." He was giving her a choice. A real one. Not a life dictated by debt or fear, but a life of her own choosing. She looked at this man, this feared, powerful, lonely man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had fought for her, and who was now offering to let her go because he thought it was what she deserved. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her choice had been made the moment she decided to warn him. "I don't want to be free of you, Dante," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I want to be with you." The words hung in the air, a confession and a promise. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding forever, and then he pulled her into his arms. This kiss was not like the first, tender one. It was a claiming, a confession, a release of all the tension, fear, and hidden longing that had built between them for weeks. It was fire and promise, a silent vow that from this night forward, they would face the shadows together. Weeks later, the city had a new story to tell. The tale of the coup that failed, of Dante DeLanza's unshakable power. But they also spoke of the woman by his side. She was no longer the maid, no longer just the woman under his protection. She was Ava. His partner. His equal. The one who held his heart. He was still the feared Mafia Boss, but now, when he looked at her, the whole city could see that the most powerful man in its underworld was, finally, at peace. He had found his keeper, not of his house, but of his soul. Their story is far from over. New challenges will always arise in a world of power and secrets. To follow Ava and Dante on their next journey, to discover what new dangers and passions await them in this city of shadows and light, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next.